My name's Oak Norton. I'd like to start off by asking my daughter, who didn't anticipate this, to stand up at the back. She's the reason I'm here today. She's my 16-year-old. Thank you. And back in 2004, she was in third grade, and it was getting close to the end of the school year, and I went in for a parent-teacher conference, and I asked the teacher, hey, I noticed that Savannah hasn't been taught the times tables yet, and I remember doing that 30 years ago in third grade. When are you going to start? You know, there's only a couple months left in the school year. She said, oh, we don't do that anymore. I said, what? She said, yeah, it's not part of the curriculum. I said, well, if it's not part of the curriculum, how do you expect children to learn their times tables? And she said, 22-year veteran teacher, well, the smart kids will just pick it up as they go. So after I picked my jaw up off the floor, I went down to the principal's office, and he said, okay, I know it's different from how you and I grew up, but all the studies show that the kids turn out just fine this way. So this was called investigations math. It's a style. It's not just that curriculum, and it's all over Utah and all over the country. Investigations math in particular removed the times tables, long division, and division by fractions from the curriculum, which effectively removes any future in math that these children have. This is called a constructivist approach because children are asked to construct their own knowledge. The teachers no longer teach it. The children are just guided by the teachers into constructing their own knowledge. Well, I started to do some research after a certain point of frustration, after buying some flashcards for her as well, to take that into my own hands. And so the research led me to a project follow-through. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of this study, but it's the largest federal study on education that's ever been performed. It cost $1 billion. It covered 180 schools, 79,000 children, and they watched these children for 30 years to see which curriculum approach they had when they were growing up and how they turned out in the end after they'd gone through college. This was the results. Direct instruction there on the bottom was the only one that showed significant progress in actually transmitting knowledge. That's kind of the purpose of our culture, isn't it? To transmit knowledge from one generation to the next. Well, that was the only one that showed any success. So the action plan that the federal government came up with, the Department of Education, you think they switched to direct instruction as the most effective method to teach children? No. You think they put more money into failing programs like constructivism? Yes. And so we wound up with a huge, huge problem in education because they knew that this was an ineffective way to teach, and yet they were doing it anyway. So why dumb down math? Math teaches reasoning and logic. It's a foundation for geometry where you develop your thinking skills. Algebra has also been shown to be the #1 success factor across all majors in college success. A loss of math skills affects all thinking skills. Back in 1961, Cleon Skousen wrote a book called The Naked Communist. I'm sure some of you have read that. In that book, he lists off 45 goals of the communists. One of them was to get control of the schools, soften the curriculum, put the party line in textbooks. Gain control of student newspapers was another one. Support any socialist movement to give centralized control over any part of the culture, such as education. Infiltrate and gain control of more unions. The NEA just endorsed Saul Alinsky. Emphasize the need to raise children away from the negative influence of parents. Attribute prejudices, mental blocks, and retarding of children to the suppressive influence of parents. Yuri Bezmenov was a KGB defector. He came here sometime maybe early 70s, and he did a series of interviews with an individual named Ed Griffin. Some of you know him as the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, about the Federal Reserve. Well, Bezmenov had outlined 4 steps that the communists take to overturn a country, to bring it to communist rule. The first one is a process called demoralization. This isn't putting people down and calling them names and demoralizing them. This is literally demoralization in terms of making them immoral. And the KGB knew that if you have an immoral people, they cannot recognize truth when it's presented to them with great clarity. There's no light in them. And so they said this would take about 15 to 20 years to demoralize a population, and they do it through the schools. That's why it takes 15 to 20 years. They had to get control of the schools and then pump those kids full of immoral behavior and basically remove God from the picture. Once that happens, you can destabilize a country. That takes 2 to 5 years where they create tipping points. And then they create a crisis. Not that we've had any crises in the last couple years that our government's told us about, but this takes just a period of a few weeks. We have a crisis. We have to act now. And then the government can come in and say, everything is normalized. We've got control of the situation. Complete control. That's the point of how they transition a country from a religious country into a communist nation. George Washington, in his farewell address, said that religion and morality are indispensable supports and that they are the great pillars of human happiness. If we contrast these two forms of government, communism has a goal to enslave mankind. Just bring them under one rule. Immoral people can't recognize truth, so if we remove the basis for morality by removing God, we do that through promoting atheism. We make humanism state religion, and the people slide into bondage. In the United States Republic, our founding fathers had a goal to free mankind. They said, let's have a constitution based on natural law, which only works when people respect the law. This is what Washington was talking about. Respect for the law comes through morality, and moral teachings are learned through religion. The result is you have a righteous, moral people who can enjoy freedom. What do our national educators today say about the educational process, what it's for? Dr. Chester Pierce at Harvard says, every child in America entering school at the age of 5 is insane because he comes to school with certain allegiances to our founding fathers, toward our elected officials, toward his parents, toward a belief in a supernatural being, and toward the sovereignty of this nation as a separate entity. It's up to you as teachers to make all these sick children well by creating the international child of the future. Some of you are probably familiar with this diagram. You learned this in college, right? Bloom's taxonomy, his hierarchy of learning. Do you have any idea what he meant by higher order thinking? He said it. He said, a student attains higher order thinking when he no longer believes in right or wrong. A large part of what we call good teaching is a teacher's ability to obtain effective objectives by challenging the student's fixed beliefs. A large part of what we call teaching is that the teacher should be able to use education to reorganize a child's thoughts, attitudes, and feelings. John Goodlad, who Susie talked about, said, public education has served as a check on the power of parents. And this is another powerful reason for maintaining it. He also said, most youth still hold the same values as their parents. If we do not alter this pattern, if we don't re-socialize, our system will decay. Back in 2009, after fighting the math war for several years and succeeding in getting the state to raise its math standards, I started to look at the history standards. And I discovered that the word republic didn't even appear in our Utah history standards, kindergarten to 12th grade. How are teachers going to teach something that they're not even asked to teach? So I started a petition at utahsrepublic.org to the state board to ask them to change 5 standards I'd identified so that we would recognize that we're a constitutional republic. I just want to give you a few examples of things that are in the state standards. This is a 6th grade standard. The objective is determine human rights and responsibilities in the world. A, identify rights considered essential for all humans. For example, health care, education, safety, freedom from fear, freedom of expression. Part B, propose steps individual students can take to protect these rights. For example, support for sister schools, energy and resource conservation, letter writing, career choices, fundraising efforts. So we teach them those things and then get them to be activists for those things. 8th grade objective, determine the role of the Constitution as a living document. Further on, determine how judicial review makes the Constitution a living document. Any idea these were in here? Here's another one. this is a contrast. I'm so glad David Barton was here this morning. The Utah standard says, examine the impact of McCarthyism. That's all we ask our classes to do, to look at McCarthyism and basically call him a witch hunter. Texas, that just passed brand new standards, changes that to examining McCarthyism and the House Un-American Activities Committee, the findings of which were confirmed by the Venona Papers. So at least let's give both sides of the story to our children and let them be able to come to a proper understanding of what McCarthy did and why. So I want to give you a few ideas, planting acorns since I'm an oak. We have in our state, a few years ago, we had this big battle over the math standards. We had awful standards. It took us a few years to get them raised. And it was a very involved process, bringing in experts, and basically the process was not smooth. And so this past year, with the Common Core standards that many of you have heard of, our state office and state board voted to approve them unanimously without public hearings, without going through any of the headaches that we went through before. There's a number of problems with this. For one, these are standards that have never been used anywhere. They're unproven. It's a huge cost to implement. We didn't get any of the race to the top money that the state office wanted, so we don't have anything to subsidize this. It's going to be very expensive to put this in. One of the changes that's really expensive is in high school, it changes it from discrete courses, like a course on geometry, trigonometry, and algebra 2, to an integrated approach, so that you have a little of everything going along as you teach. And the problem with that is only the fuzzy programs, like the constructivist approach, are really ready to take and step into that situation. And the tests that are going to be written are by a group led by a social justice education activist. So we've got a problem with the new Common Core standards. I think we need to reject these standards and go back to the standards we just passed a couple years ago, not ask our teachers to jump into a brand new set. I want to share one more thing here. The Utah population over the last 60 years has grown from about 700,000 to 2.8 million citizens. It's quadrupled. The number of school districts in our state has grown all the way from 40 to 41. And that 41 was very recent, as some of you know, because it's gotten a big black eye in the community. So on a per school district basis, the Utah population per school district has just skyrocketed. Now let me compare that and contrast that to, say, a religious organization that some of you are familiar with, the LDS population. The LDS Church has grown from 1 million members to almost 14 million over that same period of time. They've split over and over and over again to ensure local control. They've grown from 180 stakes to almost 2,900. What that's done is it's actually brought down the number of members of the church per stake. So, what if high schools were districts? Right now we've got 40 high schools, or 116 high schools, but we have 40 school districts. So what if every high school was a district for the schools that fed into it? The residents per district would drop from 67,000 to 23,000. The number of school board members would triple, so you'd have much closer control. The number of students per district would average about 4,500, which is remarkably close to an LDS stake. Current school board members spend about 15 to 20 hours a week on district work, at least in the big districts like Alpine, where I'm from. Smaller districts mean less work per member. More people are willing to run for office because it's not such a huge time commitment. It's less expensive to run for office, especially if we implement partisan school board races, which I think is a must. And it would cut their responsibilities to just a few hours a week, and we could really empower the school community council as a local group of parents to run things in that school. We could also privatize the maintenance and busing and let the schools just focus on academics. So in summary, there is a planned destruction of America. It's happened at the national level. Charlotte Iserbyt, author of The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, has written and documented a huge book when she served there as Reagan's senior policy advisor. It is absolutely out to demoralize our children and dumb them down. And that makes it all the much easier for them to not recognize truth when it's presented to them and to notice these things that are happening with the humanist and progressive education. And it's all about the social engineering of our children. So the solutions that I see, partisan school board elections would be my first pick. That would change things in a huge way. Second would be shatter the power grip over education by breaking up the districts. They are just power centers. And repeal the Common Core standards adoption and implement a thorough review of the state standards. We need some real change to happen so that we teach our children at least both sides of the story. And I invite you all to go to utahsrepublic.org, sign the petition, and get on our mailing list if you want to stay up on these education-related issues. Thank you.